Nell Ferris reached the gate at dusk, when the last gray light had given up entirely, and the dark came in from the fields like something with weight. Her fingers closed around the iron bars. Frost had made the metal burn, not cold the way cold should feel, but sharp, immediate, the way a brand feels before the pain catches up. She pressed her palms flat against the bars anyway. She had nothing left to be careful with. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since Mrs. Crail had stood in the kitchen doorway at Crail House and said the word theft with her chin lifted and her eyes fixed somewhere above Nell's head. 3 weeks of perished doors and turned-away faces and one night in a hay barn that smelled of rot. 2 days since anything had passed her lips but ditch water. Her knees buckled. She did not decide to slide down. Her legs simply stopped. The lowest crossbar caught her forehead, and she let it hold her there, iron against her brow, her breath coming in short, ragged clouds that dissolved before they reached the gravel path beyond. The shadows past the gate were wrong. Too thick for dusk. Too settled, as if they had been there since morning and intended to stay. She pressed her mouth shut against the cold and tasted iron on her lips. "Please," she whispered, "someone." The gravel path stretched into dark and gave nothing back. Then a lamp appeared. Not carried, held. Held steady at a height no servant would hold a lamp, arm extended, the flame burning without a flicker in the evening air. The shadows beyond the gate pulled back from the light. Not gradually, the way shadows retreat when a candle moves, all at once as if repelled. Nell's fingers tightened on the bars. The man holding the lamp was tall, pale in a way that had nothing to do with winter. He stood without moving, not the stillness of a man who had paused, but the stillness of something that did not need to shift its weight, did not need to adjust its balance, did not breathe in the cold air and leave any trace of itself in the dark. No breath. She could see her own, still coming in those short, ragged clouds. His, nothing. His eyes were gray. Then the lamplight caught them, and they were not gray. For one moment they shifted, wine dark, burgundy, the color of something ancient and not quite right. And then they were gray again, and she told herself it was the cold making her see things. She tried to stand. Her hands shook so badly she could not grip the bars properly. She got one knee under her, and her leg refused the rest. She tried again, failed again. "I am not a thief," she said. Her voice came out wrong, thin, stripped of the steadiness she had kept for 3 weeks by sheer force of will. "I was told there might be work." Her voice cracked on the word work. She could not repair it. He looked at her. He said nothing for a long time. A living man would have shifted his weight, cleared his throat, looked away. He did neither. He simply looked, with those gray eyes that had been something else a moment ago, and the lamp burned without moving in his hand. Then he reached for the gate. No key. One hand. The iron moved as if it weighed nothing, as if 30 years of rust and frost had never happened. And the hinges did not creak. They should have. Old iron always speaks. These were silent. He said one word. "Stay." It fell like a stone dropped into still water. Not a command, exactly. Not a request. Something older than either. The word landed in her chest and sat there, and she did not know what it meant. Only that it meant something, and that he had not said it lightly. Inside the house, behind the vast, dark face of Greymere Hall, something ceramic struck a hard surface. A sharp, deliberate sound, as if someone had set a tray down too hard. Mrs. Tarrant appeared at the front door before Nell had managed to get upright. She was a woman of 60 or more, iron-haired, with the kind of face that had learned to show nothing and had been practicing for decades. But her hands gripped the doorframe, white at the knuckles. "My lord," her voice was level. "The east parlor?" He did not answer her. He was still looking at Nell. Mrs. Tarrant tried again, quieter this time, the words careful as something handled with tongs. "You have not used that word in this house for a very long time, sir." "I know," he said. That was all. 2 words, and the weight of them pressed the air flat. Nell did not understand the exchange. She understood only that something had passed between them, something with history in it, something that had made a composed woman grip a doorframe, and that she was too hungry and too cold to parse it. Mrs. Tarrant came down the steps and took Nell's arm. Not gently, practically, the way you take the arm of someone who is about to fall and you would rather they did not. The entrance hall was vast, candlelit, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the grate. The fire was real. She could feel its heat from 6 feet away. But the cold came from the walls themselves, from the stone, from something older than the building. Portraits lined the staircase. Nell's eyes moved across them as Mrs. Tarrant steered her forward. Faces from another century. Faces from 2 centuries. And then one, a woman in Georgian dress, powdered hair, a particular set to the jaw, with Lord Vael's exact jawline, the same line from cheekbone to chin. The painting was at least 100 years old. Mrs. Tarrant steered her past it quickly. The candle flames leaned as Lord Vael passed beneath them. Nell saw it from the corner of her eye. They bent toward him, each one as if drawn, and then righted themselves after he had gone. She filed it away with the gate hinges and the breath he did not have. Her mind was too tired to do anything else with it. The kitchen was below stairs, large and stone-flagged, and smelling of herbs and rendered fat, and the particular warmth of a range that had been burning all day. Mrs. Tarrant set her in a chair at the oak table and moved to the range without a word. Mary, the kitchen maid, stood in the doorway to the scullery, eyes wide, watching. Mrs. Tarrant set a bowl before Nell. Not charity broth, not the thin gray water of parish soup. Proper broth. Marrow and herbs, a slick of fat on the surface, steam rising in a column that made Nell's hands move before her mind had decided anything. She wrapped both hands around the bowl. The heat was almost painful against her frost-burned palms. She drank too fast. Her body had forgotten patience. She coughed, hard, and had to set the bowl down. "Slower, girl," Mrs. Tarrant said. "Your stomach has forgotten how to work." Nell pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. "How did you know?" "I have seen hunger before." Mrs. Tarrant's voice did not soften. "Not recently enough." Mary was still watching from the doorway. Mrs. Tarrant turned and looked at her, just looked, and Mary disappeared back into the scullery without a sound. Mrs. Tarrant sat across from Nell. She folded her hands on the table and studied her with the directness of someone who had spent 30 years making assessments and acting on them. "What is your trade?" Nell set the bowl down. She pressed her fingertips to the table surface. Oak, worn smooth by decades of hands, the grain running under her fingers like something reliable. The texture steadied her. She pressed harder, feeling the warmth the wood had taken from the kitchen air. "Cook," she said. "I was cook at Crail House until 3 weeks ago." Something moved across Mrs. Tarrant's face. A flicker, quickly controlled, but there. "We have not had a cook in 4 months," she said. Lord Vael does not. She stopped. A deliberate stop, not a lost thought. She changed direction the way a ship changes course, smoothly, without acknowledging the turn. There is a room above the kitchen, clean linen, a lock on the door. You will sleep there tonight. Nell looked at her. And tomorrow? Mrs. Tarrant stood. Her chair scraped once against the stone floor, and then she was upright, composed, the flicker gone as if it had never been. Tomorrow is tomorrow. She left without another word. Nell sat alone in the kitchen. The range ticked. The fire in the grate threw shadows that stretched longer than the room should have allowed. Long, thin shapes reaching toward the far wall, toward the door as if something beyond the room were pulling at them. She pressed her fingers flat against the oak. She kept them there. The broth bowl was empty. The room was warm. She was not safe. And some part of her that had survived 3 weeks on ditch water and stubbornness knew it clearly. She did not know what stay meant, not the way he had said it. She knew only that the word was still sitting in her chest, heavy and unasked for, and that the housekeeper's knuckles had gone white at the sound of it. Her fingers pressed harder into the oak grain. The shadows stretched. The fire burned. Greymere Hall settled around her in silence, and the silence had teeth. Nell stayed until the fire burned low. Sleep at the table was not an option. She was not that far gone. But she sat until the kitchen settled into its night sounds, the tick of cooling iron, the occasional shift of coals, the distant creak of a house that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the weather. Then she pushed back the chair, took the candle Mrs. Tarrant had left on the mantel, and found the stairs. The room above the kitchen was small. A single window, high and narrow, a bed with a wool blanket, a washstand, a chair. Clean, as promised. Cold in the way all stone rooms are cold when they have not been slept in for some time. She set the candle on the washstand and sat on the edge of the bed and did not think about anything at all. That was a skill she had learned. You could empty yourself out like a bowl. You could hold nothing until morning. She slept. She woke before dawn, as she always had. A cook's habit. The dark outside the window was still full dark, no gray in it yet, and the cold had settled deeper into the room while she slept. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house. It breathed differently than Crail House. Older rhythms, longer silences between the settling sounds, as if the walls were in no hurry. Then she saw the dress. It was laid across the chair. Plain gray wool, pressed flat. A small mend at the left cuff, done in thread that nearly matched. Not new, but clean and pressed, and left there while she slept. She sat up and looked at it for a long moment. It fit. That was the thing that stopped her, standing in the middle of the room with the dress on and her hands at her soles. It fit as if someone had looked at her and known, not guessed, known. She went downstairs. Mary was already at the range, coaxing the coals with a long-handled poker, her back to the door. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's bread and cold ash. Pre-dawn light came through the high windows in thin gray sheets, barely enough to work by. The range ticked as it heated, metal expanding against metal. "Mrs. Tarrant says you are to inventory the larder," Mary said, without turning. Nell stopped at the foot of the stairs. "I was told I might cook." Mary turned then. She was young, 17, perhaps 18, with a round, careful face and the particular wariness of someone who had learned to be quiet in a house that required it. Her eyes went to the floor. "Lord Vael does not eat, miss. Not as such." She caught herself. "I mean, he dines late. Very late. Alone." Nell's fingers found the edge of the kitchen counter. Stone, slightly damp from the night air, cool under her thumb. She pressed into it and felt the grain of it, the small roughness where the surface had worn unevenly over decades of use. "The larder is through there," Mary said, gesturing toward the far door. "Mind the east corridor. We do not go down the east corridor." Nell looked at the door, then at Mary. "Why not?" Mary's hands tightened on the poker. "Mrs. Tarrant says so." That was all. Mary turned back to the range and the conversation was finished, and Nell went to inventory the larder. It was vast. She had not expected that. 6 staff in a house this size, and the larder was stocked for 30. Flour in sealed crocks, enough for months. Preserved meats hung from the ceiling in neat rows. Sugar, refined and raw both. Spices in labeled jars. Cinnamon, cloves, mace. A small dark bottle of vanilla that she had not seen since Crail House, where Mrs. Crail had kept the expensive things locked away and doled them out by half measure as if they were medicine. Nell's hands moved by instinct. She lifted, tested, arranged. She pressed her palm against a crock of flour was to feel whether the seal was sound. She held a jar of preserved plums to the thin light from the high window and checked the color. This was what she knew. This was the language her hands spoke without her having to think. Then her hands stopped. She was holding a jar of honey. Dark amber, thick, the kind that came from late-season hives. Her grip had gone white-knuckled without her noticing. She stood in the middle of the larder with a jar of honey in both hands, and 3 weeks pressing down on her from somewhere behind her ribs. 3 weeks. Hedgerows and parish kitchens and the particular shame of holding out her hands for thin soup while women who had never gone hungry looked at her with careful pity. 3 weeks of walking until her feet bled inside her boots, of sleeping in doorways and hay-smelling outbuildings, of eating what she could find and pretending she was not frightened. And here there was honey. She set the jar down too hard. The glass rang against the shelf, a sharp, bright sound in the cold silence. She pressed both palms flat on the shelf. Pine, rough-grained, real. The cold of the stone floor came up through her shoes. The smell of dried lavender hung from the ceiling in small bundles, faint and sweet. She pressed her palms harder into the pine and felt the grain of it bite into her skin. She would not cry. She had not cried when Mrs. Crail stood in the kitchen doorway and called her a thief in front of the other staff, her voice perfectly composed, her mourning silk perfectly pressed. She had not cried when the constable took her arm and walked her to the gate. She had not cried in 3 weeks of everything that followed. She was not going to cry over honey. Her throat closed anyway. She stood very still and pressed her palms into the shelf and waited for her breathing to steady. The lavender smell helped. The roughness of the pine helped. The weight of the honey jar, still warm from her grip, sat at the edge of her vision. Mary appeared in the doorway. "Miss Ferris? Are you—" "Mrs. Tarrant sent me to check." Nell did not turn around. Her voice came out flat. "Tell Mrs. Tarrant the stores are sufficient for 6 months." A pause. "Are you well, miss?" "I am counting jars." Mary's footsteps retreated. Nell was not counting jars. She stood in the larder until her breathing steadied and the tightness in her throat loosened, and she was herself again, or close enough to herself that it would do. Then she straightened, smoothed her apron, and went back to work. By evening she had catalogued everything. By the time the clock in the hall struck 6, she had also, without being asked, lit the range to full heat and begun to cook. Not because anyone had told her to, because the range was there, and the ingredients were there, and her hands had spent all day touching things without making anything. And that was a particular kind of wrong she could not sustain. She made stew, root vegetables, herbs from the larder's dried bundles, the marrow bones left from yesterday's broth. Simple, honest. The kind of thing that fed people rather than impressed them. The kitchen filled with steam and the smell of thyme and the particular warmth that only comes from a pot that has been tended properly. Mrs. Tarrant appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment without speaking, watching. Nell kept her attention on the pot. "He will not eat it," Mrs. Tarrant said. Nell lifted the ladle and tasted. More salt. She reached for the crock. "Then you will. And Mary and Thomas and I." Something moved at the corner of Mrs. Tarrant's mouth. Almost a smile. Almost. "You have spine, Nell Ferris," she said. "That will either save you or ruin you in this house." Nell set the ladle back against the pot's edge. "It has already ruined me once." Mrs. Tarrant pulled out a chair and sat. She folded her hands on the table with the deliberate care of someone setting down something heavy. The clock in the hall struck 8. Shadows pooled in the kitchen corners despite the fire, thicker than the light should have allowed. 31 years I have kept this house," Mrs. Tarrant said. "I was hired by Lord Vael's father." Nell stirred the pot. The steam rose in slow curls. His father looked exactly like him. Mrs. Tarrant paused. Exactly. Nell's hands stilled on the ladle. Mrs. Tarrant let the silence sit for a moment, the way a woman lets a statement sit when she wants it to be heard properly. Then she said, "Do not go down the east corridor. Do not enter the library after midnight. And do not, ever, ask him about the portrait on the stairs." Nell turned from the pot. "What is in the east corridor?" "Nothing that concerns you tonight." Mrs. Tarrant stood. Her chair scraped once against the stone floor. "The stew is ready. Serve it at 8:30. Lord Vael will not come to table. He never does." She left. Her footsteps faded down the corridor, measured and unhurried, the same rhythm as the night before. Nell looked at the pot. She looked at the doorway where Mrs. Tarrant had been. His father looked exactly like him. Exactly. She served the stew at 8:30. Mary ate with both hands around the bowl and said nothing, which was its own kind of gratitude. Thomas, the footman, nodded once and asked if there would be bread tomorrow. Nell said yes. She ate standing at the counter, the way she always had in working kitchens, because sitting felt like stopping, and she was not ready to stop. The others went to bed. She banked the fire. It was a task she had done 10,000 times. Rake the coals forward, cover with ash, leave enough heat to catch in the morning without burning through the night. Her hands knew it without instruction. She was crouched at the grate, the small iron rake in her grip, when the door opened. No sound. No creak of hinge. No footstep on the threshold. Just the door, and then Lord Vael standing in the doorway. He was dressed as if the day had not ended for him. Dark coat, no concession to the hour. His eyes were gray in the low light. The candles on the mantel did not lean toward him the way the hall candles had. They bent away. Slightly, barely, as if the air around him moved in a direction the flame did not want to follow. Nell stood. She wiped her hands on her apron. You cooked, he said. Not a question. Yes, my lord. He stepped into the kitchen. One step, two. The temperature dropped. Not sharply, not the dramatic cold of an open window, but enough. Enough that her next breath came out as faint vapor, a small white cloud in the warm kitchen air. She watched it form and disappear, and did not look at him. The last cook left 4 months ago, he said. She said the kitchen was too cold. Nell looked at the range. The coals glowed orange through the grate, steady and sufficient. The kitchen is fine. The range holds heat well. He looked at her then. A long look. The kind that does not move across a face but settles on it. The way a man looks at something he is trying to place in a category that does not yet exist. She had been looked at with contempt. She had been looked at with pity. This was neither. This was older than either. She did not flinch. Mrs. Tarrant tells me you were accused of theft, he said. Her jaw tightened. The iron rake was still in her hand, and she was aware of it, the weight of it, the small anchor of something solid. I was accused. I did not steal. I know. 2 words, flat, certain, with no room in them for doubt. The question formed and she held it back. There was no way to ask, and some part of her understood that the answer would not be simple. He turned toward the door. He moved the way he had moved at the gate, too controlled, too precise, each motion exactly as large as it needed to be, and no larger. He reached the doorway. He stopped. He did not turn back. His voice came from the doorway, directed at the dark corridor beyond it. The word I said at the gate. You do not know what it means. Nell set the rake down against the grate. No. Good. He left. The corridor beyond the door was darker than an unlit corridor should be. Not simply the absence of light, but something thicker, something that had weight and preference. The shadows gathered at the edges of the doorframe and held. The kitchen warmed by 2 degrees the moment he was gone. She felt it on her face, the small return of heat, the way the air loosened. Nell stood by the banked fire and looked at the open door. He knew she had not stolen. He knew it the way Mrs. Tarrant knew she had been hungry, not by being told, not by inference, but with the flat certainty of someone who had access to information that no ordinary man should have. He had said, "Stay at the gate," and the word had weight. He had said, "I know in the kitchen," and it had the same weight, the same quality of something decided rather than deduced. She pressed her thumb against the iron rake's handle. Cool metal, slightly rough with age. Real. The corridor beyond the door stayed dark, darker than it should have been. Darker than the single unlit passage between the kitchen and the front of the house had any right to be. As if the dark had followed him and left some of itself behind. Nell did not know what he was. She knew what he was not. He was not a reclusive aristocrat who kept odd hours and forgot to eat. He was not a man whose father had worn his exact face. He was not someone who moved through a house the way ordinary men moved, or looked at a woman the way ordinary men looked, or made the temperature of a room drop simply by entering it. No word she knew could hold what he was. She was not certain she wanted one. The fire ticked behind her, settling into its banked quiet. The open door held its dark. Somewhere deep in Greymere Hall, in the east wing, or the library, or some room she had not been shown, something that was not quite a man moved through the night in no particular hurry. She picked up the candle from the mantel. The kitchen door stayed open. Something in her refused to close it. She left it open to the dark corridor, the way you leave a window open when you are not yet ready to decide whether the night air is dangerous or necessary. And she went upstairs to the small, cold room and lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling until sleep took her. In the morning, she would look out the kitchen window. That knowledge was still hours away. Morning came through the kitchen window in a thin, pale sheet. Nell had the bread knife in her hand before she saw it. The carriage sat at the end of the gravel drive, dark against the frost-white lawn, and the crest on its door caught the winter light. A falcon on blue, wings spread, talons down. She knew that crest. She had looked at it every morning for 4 years from the servant's entrance. She set the bread knife down, very carefully. The blade touched the counter without a sound. Mary came in from the passage, her cap slightly crooked, her face uncertain. There is a lady at the front door. She says she is looking for a servant who stole from her. I did not steal. Nell's voice was level, flat as the counter. Mary twisted her hands in her apron. Mrs. Tarrant has gone to the door. Nell pressed her fingertips to the stone counter. Cold, grained, real. The kitchen had begun to feel like hers. The range, the copper pots, the particular creak of the third drawer. Now it felt borrowed. It had always been borrowed. Everything she had ever stood in had been borrowed. Where is Lord Vael? She asked. Mary hesitated. He does not receive visitors before noon. She stopped, started again. He does not receive visitors before noon. Nell looked at the bread knife on the counter. The winter light caught its edge. Her pulse was steady in her throat, visible if anyone had been watching. No one was watching. She untied her apron. The entrance hall was cold in a different way than the kitchen. Not the cold of stone and morning air, but the cold of a space that had never quite warmed. A cold that lived in the walls. Mrs. Tarrant stood at the vestibule threshold like a woman who had been standing in doorways for 31 years and had never once been moved from one against her will. Mrs. Crail stood on the other side of her. She wore traveling clothes, charcoal wool with black trim, morning silk at the collar that cost more than Nell had earned in any single year at Crail House. Her footman had opened the carriage door. She had not touched the handle. She never touched handles. Behind her, half in the shadow of the open doorway, stood Edwin, his coat too fine, his face too pale, his eyes on the floor. I have come for the girl, Mrs. Crail said. Her voice was the same voice Nell had heard dismiss a kitchen maid for breaking a teacup. Precise, certain, already finished with the conversation. She stole from my household, and I have every right to reclaim her, or see her arrested. Mrs. Tarrant did not move. This is Greymere Hall. You do not make demands here. I demand nothing. Mrs. Crail's chin lifted. I state facts. The girl is a thief. Nell stepped into the doorway behind Mrs. Tarrant. She had removed her apron. Her hands were clean. Her chin was up. I am not a girl, Mrs. Crail, she said, and your son knows who took the silver. Edwin flinched. It was small, a tightening of the shoulders, a shift of weight, but it was there. He did not look up. Mrs. Crail's face hardened. The skin around her jaw went tight. You dare, in someone else's house, you dare accuse my son. Edwin said nothing. His eyes stayed on the floor. Perhaps this conversation should continue when the master is available, Mrs. Tarrant said. Her voice had not changed pitch. It never did. Mrs. Crail's gaze moved from Mrs. Tarrant to Nell, and back again. The way a woman looks at furniture, she is deciding whether to move. I do not wait on country lords who keep their doors shut past 10. The candles in the entrance flickered. The front door was still open behind Mrs. Crail, and the winter air pushed steadily into the hall, cold and purposeful, as if it had been waiting for an invitation. The drawing room was Mrs. Tarrant's concession to civility. She had put them there the way you put something dangerous in a contained space, not to make it comfortable but to keep it from spreading. Mrs. Crail sat. Edwin stood by the mantel and looked at the fire. Nell stood. Thomas had been sent for Lord Vael. The room was quiet except for the fire and Edwin's breathing. When I dismissed you, Mrs. Crail said, I thought you would go quietly. She did not look at Nell directly. She spoke to the middle distance, the way she had always spoken about servants in their presence. That is what your kind does. Disappear. Find some other kitchen. Instead, you attach yourself to the first gentleman who shows pity. Nell's composure held. 1 sentence. 2. On the third, your kind, something cracked. Not loudly. The way ice cracks under weight before it gives. A sound you feel more than hear. A fracture running through something that had been holding too long. I walked for 3 weeks. Her voice was not loud. It was not steady. I slept in hedgerows. I ate what I could find in fields. I came here because I had nowhere else. Her eyes burned. She turned toward the window. The glass was cold where her breath fogged it. Outside, the frost-white lawn stretched to the tree line, pale and indifferent. She could see her own reflection, jaw locked, eyes wet, hands fisted at her sides. She looked like a woman who had been holding herself together with both hands for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to let go. The door opened. Lord Vael did not hurry. He never hurried. He moved through the doorway the way he moved through every space, each step exactly as large as it needed to be, nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. The moment he entered, the candles on the mantel dimmed. No wind, no draft. They simply gave less light, as if the room had decided to rearrange its shadows around him. The temperature dropped. Edwin took 1 step backward. He did not seem to know he had done it. Lord Vael's eyes found Nell first. She was facing the window. Her shoulders were rigid, her reflection visible in the glass. Everything she was trying to hide laid out in that cold pain for anyone who looked. He looked. She felt it the way you feel a hand near a flame without touching. The proximity, the attention, the particular quality of being seen by something that sees very well. No movement toward her, no word for her. He stood perfectly still and turned his gaze to Mrs. Crail. Mrs. Crail. His voice was quiet. The room felt smaller. You are in my house. Mrs. Crail had not survived widowhood and a wastrel son by being easily frightened. She straightened in her chair. Lord Vael, I presume. This woman entered my employ under false pretenses and left with my silver. I require her return or her arrest. Lord Vael looked at Edwin. Your son is sweating, Mrs. Crail, he said, in a cold room. Everyone looked at Edwin. His hands were shaking, a fine, visible tremor, the kind that comes from the inside out. He pressed them flat against his thighs and stared at the fire. My son is irrelevant to. Your son sold 12 pieces of Crail silver to a dealer in Hartfield on the 14th of October. Lord Vael's voice did not rise. It did not need to. The dealer's name is Marsh. The amount was 42 pounds. Silence. The fire had dropped to embers. No time had passed. The coals had simply stopped giving heat, as if the room had decided it no longer needed to pretend at warmth. How could you possibly? Mrs. Crail's hand found the arm of her chair. Her fingers gripped it. I know a great many things about a great many families in this county. Lord Vael held her gaze. Some of that knowledge is very old. His eyes shifted. It happened in a single breath. Gray to burgundy, dark as old wine. Dark as something that had no name in any language Mrs. Crail had ever spoken. She did not blink, but her knuckles went white on the chair arm, and the certainty she had walked in with, that particular armored certainty of a woman who had never once been told she was wrong, cracked at its edges. Edwin made a small sound, not a word, just air. Lord Vael's gaze moved from Mrs. Crail to Mrs. Tarrant, who stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had seen this before and found it no less satisfying for the repetition. See Mrs. Crail to her carriage, he said. Then he turned, not toward the door, toward the window, toward Nell. She was still facing the glass. Her reflection looked back at her. Tear-tracked now, jaw still locked, hands still fisted. She had not moved. She had not let herself move. Stay, he said, the same word, the same weight it had carried at the gate, that single syllable that had stopped her in the dark and the cold and the absolute end of her resources. But the gate had been desperation. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go. This was different. The meaning in his language was still hidden from her. What word it translated to, what century it came from, what he had lost that made him say it with that particular quiet. She only knew what it meant in hers. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Tarrant move. She heard the scrape of Mrs. Crail's chair as she rose, furious and diminished, the sound of Edwin's footsteps following his mother the way they always had. Close, silent, offering nothing. The drawing-room door opened. Cold air moved through it. Nell did not turn, not. In the window glass, Lord Vael's silhouette stood behind her, still as carved stone, the shadows of the room reaching between them like fingers extended but not yet touching. The candles on the mantel had not recovered their light. The fire had not recovered its heat. The room held its cold and its dark and its silence, and in the glass, her wet eyes and his stillness occupied the same reflection. The carriage door would close soon. The gravel would crunch under wheels. The falcon on blue would disappear down the drive. She was still here. The carriage wheels were still audible on the gravel when Mrs. Tarrant came back into the drawing room. No hurry in her step. There never was. But there was something deliberate in the way she set her feet. Something that said she had chosen to return here rather than anywhere else. Thomas stood in the hall doorway. Mary hovered at the far end, near the kitchen passage, her apron twisted in both hands. Mrs. Tarrant looked at Nell. You are not a thief, Nell Ferris, she said. Everyone in this house knows it now. The words landed differently than Nell expected. Not like comfort, like a verdict, like something being set right in a ledger that had been wrong for too long. Thomas nodded from the hall. A small nod, deliberate. His chin dropped once and held, and that was enough. Mary said, I set your room with fresh linen this morning, before any of this. She paused. Her hands stopped twisting. Because you made stew, and it was good, and this house needed it. The fire had rebuilt itself. Someone had fed it during the confrontation, quietly, without announcement, and now it burned properly, orange and steady, throwing real warmth across the floorboards. The sound of the Crail carriage had faded entirely. The gravel was silent. The drive was empty. Nell pressed her thumb into the windowsill. Oak, solid, worn smooth by decades of hands that had stood exactly here and looked out at exactly this view. "Thank you," she said. It cost her. The two words came out smaller than she intended, rougher, and she felt the rawness of them in her throat. Mrs. Tarrant said, "Do not thank us. You earned your place." Nell's jaw tightened. She nodded once because she did not trust herself to speak again, and because the nod was the only thing she had left that did not shake. Mary slipped back toward the kitchen. Thomas retreated into the hall. Mrs. Tarrant followed them both, pulling the drawing-room door almost closed behind her, not latched, just rested against the frame, as if she understood that what remained in this room needed air. Lord Vael had not moved. He stood by the mantel. The shadows around him were ordinary now. They fell where the candles told them to fall, where the fire told them to fall, and they stayed there. His eyes were gray. Just gray. The thing she had seen in them earlier, that dark shift, that depth that had no bottom, was quiet. "She called you a thief in front of your own household," he said. "I should have spoken sooner." Nell turned from the window. "You spoke when it mattered." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not quite an expression, the suggestion of one. "I knew about the silver before you arrived at my gate," he said. "I knew what was done to you. I knew where you had walked." Nell's hand was still on the windowsill. Her fingers pressed harder. "How?" He did not answer. Instead, he said, 27 days. You walked for 27 days. Her breath caught. The air went thin. No one knew that number. Not Mrs. Tarrant. Not even her own voice had shaped it. She had simply walked. And the days had accumulated like stones in her pockets. And she had not counted them, because counting them would have made them real. He had counted them. She looked at him, at the stillness of him, at the way he occupied the room without filling it, the way the firelight moved around him rather than across him. "The portrait on the stairs," she said. "The woman in the Georgian dress. She has your face." "She was me," he said. 2 words. Flat. Certain. No apology in them. No performance. The fire did not flicker. The candles held. The room did not change at all. And that was somehow the most unsettling thing. That a statement which rearranged everything could sit in an ordinary room without disturbing a single flame. Nell's hand found the windowsill again and gripped it. The oak was warm now from her palm. She held it and let the solidity of it anchor her, while her mind assembled what she already knew into a shape she could name. A knock. Soft. Precise. Mrs. Tarrant entered without waiting for permission. She had earned that right across 31 years, and she exercised it without apology. She looked at them both. Nell at the window, Lord Vael at the mantel, the 10 feet of charged air between them. She read it the way a woman reads a room she has tended for 3 decades, completely and without sentiment. "I have served this house for 31 years, she said. "I have watched you cycle names and faces and staff. I have said nothing." She looked at Lord Vael directly. Her chin was level. Her voice was steady. The last time you used that word, stay, it was 1793. I was not born yet. But the woman you said it to, her portrait is in the East Corridor, and you have kept her room exactly as it was. Lord Vail's jaw tightened, a small movement, almost invisible, but Nell saw it. This one is alive, my lord, Mrs. Tarrant said. She eats, she sleeps, she makes stew that fills a kitchen with warmth. Do not make her a ghost in a corridor. She left. The door clicked shut behind her. A clean, final sound. The clock in the hall began to strike midnight. The chimes came slowly, each one hanging in the air longer than it should, as if the house itself was measuring something. 1, 2, 3. Nell said, "The Vampire King." Not a question. She had assembled it. The cold, the shadows, the portrait, the centuries, the word he had spoken at the gate that had reached into her chest and held something there. She said it aloud because she needed to hear it in her own voice to know it was real. 4, 5, 6. Yes, Lord Vael said. No defense. No explanation. One word, as always, carrying the weight of everything he did not say around it. 7, 8, 9. You watched me, Nell said. For 27 days. Yes. 10, 11. Why? 12. The last chime faded into the walls and was gone. Lord Vael said, "The word I spoke at the gate. In my tongue, the old tongue, the one I spoke before this language existed, it does not mean stay." Nell's grip on the windowsill loosened slightly. What does it mean? Remain. He paused. Not as a command, as a... He stopped. His hand moved to the mantel edge. His fingers closed around the stone. She heard nothing, but she saw it. A hairline fracture appearing beneath his grip, thin as a thread, running through the carved edge of the mantelpiece. He controlled himself. The pressure stopped. The crack remained. As a request, he said, from someone who has not made a request of a living person in a very long time. Nell looked at the crack in the stone, at the proof of what he was, written into the architecture of the house by a single moment of feeling he had not managed to contain. You are asking me to remain, she said. I am asking you to choose. His voice was low. The walls absorbed it. You are not bound here. You are not in debt to me. The kitchen is yours if you want it. Greymere is... He stopped again. It has been empty for a long time. Even when it was full of people, it was empty. Nell's eyes burned. She did not look away. She let him see it. The wet edges, the rawness, all of it. Because she had spent 3 weeks hiding her face and she was finished with that. I have nowhere else, she said. That is not a choice. That is survival. Something shifted in his voice, not softer, older. I am not asking you to survive here. I am asking you to live here. The fire crackled, a log settled. The shadows in the corners stayed where they were told. Nell released the windowsill. She walked to the kitchen, not to him, to the kitchen, because that was where she understood herself, where her hands knew what to do, where the surfaces told her things she could trust. The range was banked, but not cold. She fed it. She worked the damper until the heat built properly, until she could feel it rising against her forearms when she held them near the iron. She set water to boil. She took down the honey jar. The same one. The amber glass, the cloth-tied lid, the smell that had undone her 2 days ago in the larder when she was too empty to hold herself together. She opened it now. The warmth of it rose, sweet and dark and real. She did not flinch from it. She set 2 cups on the table, one for her, one across from her. Whether he would come was beyond her knowing. Whether he drank tea, she suspected not. She set the cup anyway, because setting it was the choice and the choice was the point. The kitchen door opened. Lord Vael stood in the doorway. The shadows behind him were still. They did not reach. They did not move. They simply existed, as shadows do, obedient to the kitchen fire that burned warm and steady and ordinary. He came to the table. He sat across from her. He did not touch the cup. But he sat, and the sitting was its own kind of answer, and the kitchen held them both in its warmth without asking either of them to explain themselves. A shape appeared at the kitchen door. Mrs. Tarrant. She had come quietly, the way she did everything, and she stood for a moment looking at what was in front of her. The vampire king at a kitchen table, for the first time in 31 years, sitting across from a woman who had set a cup for him without knowing if he would come. Mrs. Tarrant said nothing. She smiled. Small, private, earned. Then she pulled the door closed, and her footsteps moved away down the passage, and the kitchen was quiet. 2 cups on the oak table, one full, one untouched. Nell's fingers wrapped around hers, the ceramic warm against her palms. Lord Vael's hands flat on the table surface, pale, still, cold, 3 inches from hers. The kitchen fire steady, the shadows in the corners behaving.